Welcome to the English Web, the electronic newsletter of the English department here at St. John's University and the College of St. Benedict. I am Luke Mancuso, the faculty editor of the English Web, and today we are delighted to welcome Katherine Powers, who comes to us with her new book, which is called Suitable Accommodations, an autobiographical story of family life, the letters of J.F. Powers, 1942 to 1963. J.F. Powers was a towering figure here in the environs of Collegeville for a number of years, taught creative writing in a legendary manner here in the English department, and was socially underfoot among faculty and residents of Collegeville and beyond. So I'd like to begin by reading from Katherine's foreword to the collection of letters, which is a kind of loose, fragmentary biography of both Jim Powers and his family. Well before the publication of his first novel, Mort Urban, in 1962, my father, J.F. Powers, henceforth called Jim, planned to write a novel about family life, an intention that persisted for the rest of his life. It was to be in some fashion the story of a writer, an artist with bright prospects, a taste for the good things in life, and an expectation of camaraderie as he made his way in the world. The letters that make up this story begin with Jim at age 25 and acceptance for publication of his first short story. Then they leap forward to letters from prison and on through those recording high hopes, great promise, and a passionate courtship and marriage to Betty Wall. Then comes the black comedy of children, 5 all told, great poverty, and luck, and balked creativity. Central to this progression is the matter of where and how to live. Jim's married life was dominated by the search for suitable accommodations, for a house that would reflect and foster the high calling of the artist. In the course of their married life, which lasted from 1946 until Betty's death in 1988, the couple moved more than 20 times. This included 8 times across the Atlantic, 4 tenures in Ireland, and 4 returns. I vacillate, Jim wrote to a friend, between wishing I had the wings of an angel, one whose wings would know where to take him, however, and a large brick house in which to hide myself with books, music, etc. So with that forward, Katherine, can you talk to us a bit about the genesis of the catch of letters, about gathering them, about the literary craft, and the kind of imaginary space you were in as you were assembling this narrative, as well as the title itself, the tantalizing title, Suitable Accommodations?
Well, let me just see if I can say this in an organized manner. First of all, well, let me tell you how I came to have the letters. First of all, we knew that everybody in the family knew that there was plenty of letters being generated, because he would be banging away on his typewriter, and then there would be envelopes ready to be put in the mail the next day. Sometimes, if there weren't envelopes ready to be put in the mail next day, then that was suggested that perhaps a novel or story was in the process. But the letters seemed to be a little more frequent, different times. But in any case, even before he died, people approached me with big envelopes of, a couple of people with envelopes of letters that they'd saved, that they thought they were so great, and I at that time had been an archivist, and they wanted me to keep them to make sure that they never just went into the void. And for instance, Joseph O'Connell, who was affiliated with this place, he gave me a wonderful treasure of 15 years worth of letters written not only to him, but to other members of the movement. And when my father, well, the thing that he called the movement, which was a group of friends who'd been drawn here in the 50s by the counter-cultural Catholic movements that circulated from the 30s, 40s, 50s. The liturgical movement, the Catholic worker movement, etc. These were his friends, and he called them, rather sardonically, the movement. Joseph O'Connell had saved a lot of the letters that were written not only from him to him, but to other people in the movement, because when my father wrote a letter to one person, it really was to everybody. In any case, that was a great treasure. The other, there's two other great treasures. One is that when my mother was dying, and the last time I saw her, which was a couple of months before she died in May in 1988, and I visited her in March 1988 with my 3-month-old child, my second son, so she got to meet him. In any case, she was very concerned about organization and what Jim was going to do without her guiding hand, etc. So she wanted me to make sure that he had recipes for this and that and the other thing and what to do about this and that. And then she said, now there's a box that I want you to bring to me. And she told me where it was. And it was hidden, and I actually can't remember where it was, but it turned out to be over 100 letters written to her from 2 days after they had met, to her from Jim, 2 days after they had met, into a couple of years of their early married life.
Oh my God.
So I brought the envelope, I brought the box to her. It was a candy box, an old candy box.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And I looked in and she said, these are letters. Do not let Jim know that you have them. I want you to take them away and save them because they're invaluable. So I didn't let him know, and I didn't, in fact, read them until he himself had died. And the reason she was worried about this was not because he would have been upset by what was in them, although that's perhaps somewhat of a possibility, but more, he would on occasion have periods of I won't call it despair, but a certain desperation where he felt it was all worthless. And that's a little of an exaggeration too, but at one point when we had to leave the United States again because a house had been sold out from under us, he had burnt 15 years worth of carbon copies of his own letters that he'd written to all and sundry, to Saul Bellow and to his friends and to other people I just can't remember at the moment. Well, in fact, I probably don't know, although I know that in some volumes of other writers' letters, there are letters that they wrote, yeah, that we had and that we sent, and so they appear in their volumes. So there was clearly a back and forth, but his letters don't exist anymore because, one, they didn't save them, and two, he burnt the carbon copies. And in fact, the fact that he made carbon copies shows how important a part of his work, in fact, the letters are. Right. And in any case, that was what she was worried about. She was worried that, particularly after she died, she didn't know what his frame of mind would be, and that might have been something so painful to find those letters that he might have just simply destroyed them. Anyway, I took those home. And the other great treasure of letters came from his friend Father Harvey Egan, whom he met in, I think it's about 1943, in St. Paul, when he was an assistant in a parish, which I can't remember which one it was, and a friend of another friend of my father's. He had saved every letter that Jim had written to him from 1943 till 1999 when Jim died. But in 1995 or so, Father Egan had given Jim back, a very dangerous thing to do.
Given his record
had given,
for incendiary
exactly, which
activity.
Perhaps Egan didn't know about. But in any case, he'd given him this whole great bundle of letters from 43 to 95 or so. And after my father died, we couldn't find them. And Father Egan kept saying they've got to be somewhere unless he destroyed them. So that, but then they turned out to be in a safety deposit box. That was the last place that I looked, and there they were. So the letters to Egan, I think, are just terrific. He was a fellow sports fan, and he had the right kind of bleak sense of humor. And anyway.
Which Jim had in spades.
Yes, which he had in spades. He was the most appreciative audience.
Indeed, indeed.
And yeah, where am I here?
You're actually you're describing so eloquently something of your own enthusiasms, because clearly this must have been a really searching and demanding time for you. I mean, you're actually doing an archaeological dig on the inner life as well as the public life of one of the great writers of the 20th century who just happened to be your father. So what you're describing for me is that your own journey was a kind of wave-like crest and decline and enthusiastic pitches and so forth. If I can focus on one of the wave crests, when you describe the passion that Jim brings to the early love letters he wrote to your mother after they had met. He proposed to her 2 days after they met, right?
Well, within 2 days. He had come from St. Paul. My mother was had graduated from St. Benedict's the previous spring, and in November, the November following, or actually the October following, Sister Mariella Gable, who was my mother's teacher and mentor, sent my father a manuscript of my mother's novel, and he thought it was fantastic, except he didn't like the first sentence and he didn't like a few things, but he thought it was amazingly, his response, I don't think any other person has ever received a response like that from him, and any person who wasn't a well-known writer. Right. In any case, so Jim came to St. Joe and met my mother, and he was here for 2 days, and sometime in those 2 days they became engaged after having never met each other, not having written to each other or anything, and then they were married 5 months later. And during those 5 months of their engagement, they wrote to each other almost every day, and my mother's side of the correspondence does not exist. He clearly threw them out, and his does, because she saved them and hid them through 20 moves. And the passion that he felt for her and his enthrallment with her is extraordinary. Really extraordinary, because not 2 months previous, certainly not 4 months previous to this, he'd been writing to a friend saying that he was probably never going to get married, and that was for other people, and he will just go his lonely way. He loved talking about going his lonely way. Although he did, in any case.
He had lots of friends, though, hence the hefty weight of this volume.
Yeah, well, he had his friends that he could tell them how much he liked to go his lonely way.
Exactly.
So he was hit, it's almost like divine intercession or something. He was hit by a thunderbolt when he met her, and the novel, I'm not sure if the novel is in, I have a couple of her novels, 3 actually, of her novels in the archives. And there's 2 early ones that I think are cobbled together from maybe that first one that he read. And they're not very good. I mean, I simply cannot imagine him praising them in the manner that he did. So something else was at work. Not, his critical faculties were, the off switch was put.
It sounds like L-O-V-E.
It was very much, yeah.
If I may, I'm going to quote from a couple of letters and perhaps have you resonate yourself about them. In 1945, shortly before he met your mother, he writes to a friend from Summit Avenue in St. Paul, "I do not believe I'll get married ever. If so, it will be like lightning. I do not expect to be hit by that either. And I will not even go so far as to say, on the other hand, you never know. I see too much too soon in women to get very far along." And then suddenly, in a short time frame thereafter, after he met your mother, this is how he's concluding one of his love letters to your mother. "I love you, Betty. It is the first time I know now I ever loved anybody. But even if I'd never met you, this I know, I had never loved anybody in the way one is supposed to, so you are the first one. Do not catch pneumonia and die. God is against these things. For some reason really known to him, and the cause for much dull absurdity on the part of the theologians, he does not want them to last. But God, I say, this is different. And not just different in the ridiculous way. I knew people thought about their affairs because theirs were different. This is different, I feel, in an absolute sense. What strikes you about that language, and how does it resonate in your own experience?
I think that's a really good example of the unity of his thought and feeling, because I think art, God, and love are all combined there and conflated and blossoming together. That's what is going on there. And then that's his imagination. I mean, he did love her, and they were very well matched. But that kind of level at which he enjoyed it was almost his own conception. It was almost part of his creation, and I think there were probably outside forces at work. But he loved the unity of it. Mm-hmm. He loved the unity of love for a woman, love for God, and art. And it's all there, I think.
Absolutely, and in some sense, you know, the ardor and the passion that he brings to this passionate attachment to your mother is also reflected in the pitiless and demanding levels of perfection that he brought to his writerly craft, or as you much more sort of fulsomely put it, art. Can you describe something of Jim's writing process, since you were hanging around the house and you just described the clacking of the typewriter and so forth? Can you describe something of that? Did it happen in waves? Did he have a set schedule? Was it a monastic sort of routine, or what?
the last thing from a set schedule. I think he did most of it at his various offices. He liked to have a little room where he could go off, and at St. John's he was up in some tower, and he really liked that.
In those days, Engel Hall, yes.
Okay. And then when we were in Ireland, he had a place in Dublin for a while, and elsewhere when we came back, another place. In St. Cloud, he had a office that he absolutely loved in the Vosburg building, Suite 7. And many of his letters and a lot of his work happened there. That place was torn down, much to his anguish. And then he moved into another. But so a lot of, I would say most of his writing went on there. And it was very painstaking in that he would write one draft and then he would change and change and change. And some of the pages of the manuscript I have, say, from Mort Durbin, are like wood. They've got so many pasted on layers. I mean, you could practically build furniture out of them. And so that's all I really can say about his process. Where his letters were more spontaneous. I have a feeling with some letters he had written a first draft and then retyped it because there aren't any mistakes at all. Some of them have crossouts and everything. But I think for him, writing a letter was just free-form language and joie de vivre, and he didn't feel it had to be perfect, and in some ways it was just a different kind of music. But it's music. It
is music, in fact. There is something about the language that is so lyrical and breezy. And Jim was anything but breezy in my friendship with him through the years, almost up until the very end. I'm going to read now a letter to your mother from about a year later. Just a small passage here, and have you talk about his initial contact with St. John's. Because if I'm not mistaken, you've unearthed here the very first time he came to St. John's and what became of that. Dear Betty, I just got up. It's hotter than hell in the apartment. I have the windows open, but no cool air comes in. Your letter, one from my mother, one from Father Garrels. About the things in your letter, it will be a sad day. Old JF writes a letter to the abbot about a job. And as any old pitchman will tell you, never give a sucker an even break. That is what I am asking for a job is like, anywhere and especially at St. John's. I have seen the abbot operate. He is a good man, but his last name is Deutsch. And if he likes if he's like a lot of other Germans, and I think he is, he expects to get to heaven for not having made many impractical moves during his stay on earth. I have often wondered why they didn't try to prove somewhere along the line that Jesus Christ received a gold watch for 33 years of service. I think, in short, you had better worry about your novel and stop thinking about me and a job. I love you for your interest. On the other hand, you are quite young and innocent. What does that sum up for you?
Well, first of all, just the last bit, he was the innocent. He somehow did think that they were with the lilies of the field, and somehow that it would all work out. What was going on there is Sister Mariella and my mother were in conversation on the possibility of a living being made. It was quite clear that there wouldn't be enough money to raise a family, and so my mother would come up with ideas like asking the abbot for a job, or she would get a job at Fandel's, which was a department store, in the book department. She had a couple of other ideas that he absolutely rejected. He didn't like the idea of a job anything aside from writing. And his father, who had provided for his family throughout the Depression in one way or another and had worked hard. My father almost looked down on him for having done that. It's extraordinary. It was part of his feeling that the material things of the world were that people were obsessed with them, and that they should be, I don't know what the artists were supposed to be doing. I mean, the people who weren't artists were supposed to be doing. But I can't really describe it, but it was part of his view of the fallen nature of the world as far as art is concerned. That people are going and doing these humdrum jobs.
Right.
It doesn't make sense. There's no way you can make sense of this as far as living is concerned.
You called him the other night at your presentation at CSB one of the most impractical of men. I believe that was the turn of phrase. Can you summon up a couple of anecdotes for us that would illustrate that in a kind of concrete or immediate way from your childhood or adolescence?
Well, I can tell you the last time, this is after the book and everything, but this is a perfect example. After my mother had died and he was still living in the house in Flynntown down the road from the Abbey, and that house was going to be destroyed, and he found another house to rent about 500 yards down the road. I think that's probably the distance.
I had dinner in both of those places many times with Jim.
So he also at that time was very ill. He had kidney disease, and he had just come out of the hospital and was very reduced. And this was 1992. My mother died in 1988. He'd spent 4 years alone in that house, and now it's 1992 and he had to move. Also, just a few months before that, my sister had died. So he was a very spiritually challenged person at that time. So I came to help him move. Well, throughout his tenure in Flynntown, the house he was moving from, he was a scavenger. And every spring when the students would leave, he would go along and see what great things had been thrown out. And he would bring these things back.
From the dumpsters, right?
Well, they were on the side of the road, I think. I don't know that he actually got...
chairs. Oh my God, it's like a furniture showroom at the end of the school year.
Yeah, and so he would, good stuff from his point of view. And then he would drag it home, and when my mother was alive, she would say, Jim, we don't have any room for this. And he'd say, well, for instance, he dragged home a Barcalounger. And
a castaway from one of our students.
Yes, exactly. And the size of a Barcalounger, it's like a car.
Exactly.
So that had to go out on the screened-in porch, and that's what was on the porch, the Barcalounger. Nobody ever sat on it. It finally became where other great finds began to pile up on top of that. Well, in any case, the whole house was filled with this stuff, so he had to move. So I came to help him. He had moved all these treasures into the new place, so there wasn't all this junk. So there wasn't any room for the stuff that he actually used. The chairs that he actually sat in, the kitchen table where he actually ate. There was all this junk in this place, and I said, well, he said, now, Katherine, I don't want you to start doing this, this big nurse thing. which is, you know, this practical thing about where things this. And I said, but, well, where are things? He said, well, you just bring it all in. Anyway, I can't remember the dialogue, but he was so impractical. He couldn't see that you fill up a house with a bunch of junk and then you move your stuff in. It's just not going to work.
Right.
And I left earlier than I had intended to. It was so frustrating to me. I knew I would come close to killing him because it offended my sense of organization, which I inherited from my mother.
Who was quite tidy and organized.
Very
and
organized.
Scheduled and
yeah,
so forth.
although she never threw anything out either. So anyway, that's just an example of his impracticality. He considered himself a realist. He thought he somehow could see what was going on. But he couldn't. He could see motives. He could see what he could make of the world in his fiction, but he wasn't actually seeing what was going on.
Right. So it was like an alternative world.
Yes.
It was like Yoknep-Petaufa County for Faulkner. Or,
Definitely.
right, or Summit Avenue
Yeah.
for Fitzgerald.
Right.
And so forth.
And his own life in the letters is kind of a made-up world.
Exactly. Now, one of the sort of antipodes to which you pose as sort of exemplifying how Jim was so impractical is that he loved to poke fun at people who had good business sense.
Yeah.
And I was doing some archaeological digging in these inimitable short stories of his, and there's a story which you cited the other night called Keystone in his last collection. And there's a bishop examining his conscience in the middle of the story, and he lists good rules for businessmen. So I'm going to read this out loud and then have you comment on it. Then, as was his custom, the bishop examined his conscience. Good rules for businessmen. Don't worry, don't overbuy, don't go security. Keep your vitality up. Keep insured, keep sober, keep cool. Stick to chosen pursuits, but not to chosen methods. Be content with small beginnings and develop them. Be wary of dealing with unsuccessful men. Be cautious, but when a bargain is made, stick to it. Keep down expenses, but don't be stingy. Make friends, but not favorites. Don't take new risks to retrieve old losses. Stop a bad account at once. Make plans ahead, but don't make them in cast iron. Don't tell what you are to do until you have done it. To the extent that these rules could be made to apply to him, and all of them could to an extent, the bishop was doing pretty well, he thought. What resonates for you? Is that some sort of acidic revenge against the sort of entrepreneurial mania of American culture? Or is it some sort of affectionate, sort of ironic wink at the way the world is?
It's a combination, I would say. What he has done with that list is create the architecture of a world. And like the architecture of his world would be art, God, and love, say. In this architecture, it is prudence and all those rafters there that are kind of holding it up.
Right.
And I think that he did not, you can see actually that you can see there's a fondness about this. He actually did kind of like a lot of that. He liked it, and he kind of rejoiced in his fiction that there was that world, there was that alternate reality, which he didn't really think of as a reality, but that people lived in a world that was made up of rules like that. But it's terribly funny that the bishop examines his conscience, and he's in the wrong building he's in the business building, not in the big building.
Exactly.
You know,
because the whole story is about the sort of post-war Catholic expansionism of building physical plants and being like a spiritual Kiwanis club of local businessmen. And it seems to me that that's Jim's fictional voice.
Yeah.
He was caught up in that, saw the irony and the contradictions, but also had a deep, tender affection for those people.
He did. He really did. And he also, in some of his spoof letters, he likes to pretend that he's a businessman.
I know.
There's the long one about the writer, when the Vikings, before they had a name, that he writes to his fellow writers in Minnesota. It's a spoof letter. He only sent it to a friend, and then also to the sports editor of the Pioneer Press. And it's a real boostering, rousing letter about how we writers of Minnesota have got to get in there and do the name, because we're the professionals. But it's written in the language of a businessman, a lot of gung-ho in it.
One of the other passages which strikes me in Keystone is his description of the incomparably named Oster-Gothenburg diocese, which figures in several of the stories. It obviously is Stearns County.
Yeah.
I mean, a stone's throw from St. John's and Wobegon and so forth. In Keystone, he writes, the Oster-Gothenburg diocese might well be what it was sometimes called the biggest little diocese in the world. For you really couldn't count Europe and South America. There might be dioceses to compare with it in the French part of Canada, but had the faithful in those dioceses been completely exposed to the temptations of a high standard of living? Oster-Gothenburg and all the roads around it blazed with invitations to drink, dine, dance, bowl, borrow money, have the car washed, and so on. But let the diocese stage a rally of some kind at the ballpark, and there wouldn't be much doing anywhere else. So, once again, there's that strange mixture, like a chemical mixture, of both a kind of envy of material success, of the provident or dutiful husband and provider, and then one foot in this otherworldly, idealized space, which we associate with the transformational nature of the church, the sacraments, the gospel of Jesus, and so forth. And I think, if I may speculate, it seems to me that that is Jim's genius, and why people like John Updike call him one of the greatest writers of the 20th century.
I agree. I couldn't have put it better. But I mean, I agree with everything you say. I don't have anything to add to it. I know that there are a couple of letters which you've actually earmarked for us, and I wonder if you would mind reading a couple of the most memorable ones for you, and then maybe riffing for us on some component of your what you discover as you read them and so forth. Well, the one I'd like to read most of was written as we were leaving Ireland again to go back to Minnesota. And I don't know how many this was after the second tenure of 4 in Ireland, but we'd moved many times, not just to Ireland. So it was the whole moving thing. And that, of course, that's why this book is called Suitable Accommodations. It was the search for suitable accommodations and his inability to make suitable accommodations.
Because you moved 20 times.
Yeah, exactly.
So it was a peripatetic childhood that you had.
Yeah, it was. But this pretty much says it all, I think. It's written to Joe and Jody O'Connell November 29th from Ireland in 1958. Well, he says, Dear Cho and Jody, that's Stearns for Joe, and I didn't bother saying that. Dear Cho and Jody, the last night in the old house, down to the furniture and lighting we found here, and finishing off the dregs, and Huey, one of their sons, my brother, whose bed has gone out on before him, crying out from the foreign couch, and Betty finally going off under a heavy load of John Power and Son gold label. Me, I've had the last of the black and white. I smoked a cigar earlier, dug out in the course of packing. I have the radio turned to a German station. I wonder what it will think of WJON. That's the St. Cloud AM station. For we are taking it with us, leaving little behind, the baby's Moses basket and 2 siphons of soda, some corrugated cardboard, some coal, some logs, some turf, and so on. We've been through this all before, but this is the worst time yet. Every time was the worst time yet. This is only the beginning of a tale of the worst time yet. Too much stuff, too many people, We have two little leather tags, and I found myself switching the little cards around tonight, rather Betty did, and thought it all too ironic. On one side the cards say, J.F. Powers, Greystones, County Wicklow, Ireland. On the other, care of Arthur Wall, my mother's father, North River Road, St. Cloud, Minnesota. The latter is showing now, among other things. We have 11 packing cases, 5 trunks, and a number of smaller pieces. A number would be about 14 of those. Fortunately, there's a worldwide shipping slump and the rates are low. We may live in our packing cases, some of which are quite roomy. It now appears, I don't know, remember if I read this part, it now appears that the potty will have to be transported separately. Earlier in their married life, he said, wrote to my mother at one point, maybe even before they were married, I can't remember what he said, I don't want to be one of these families, part of one of these families where they have to be always carrying a potty chair around with them. Well, some years later, it now appears that the potty will have to be transported separately. If it were wrapped in brown paper, it wouldn't be so noticeable, we tell each other. How fair-minded can you get? That is, oh God, that's just one of the funny little ironies of this thing. All these things that he said didn't want to happen, many of them did.
Of course.
Anyway, that is one of the letters that really sums up that peripatetic nature of his existence.
One of the sort of vacillating movements as an engaged reader who's read the letters and is so grateful to you for this book, was that I kept being moved from paragraph to paragraph from hilarity and a kind of savory, sophisticated irony to a sense of heartrending tenderness about the precarity of your lives. And I know that must have marked all of you very deeply, and you've alluded to it. If I may I ask you to describe something of growing up in a household where sort of your material security was always at risk, and your parents were so articulate that they would openly talk about it with you.
Well, they did talk about the precariousness, but they didn't talk about what their plans were. So there was a certain uncertainty, at least. I'm the eldest of the 5 children, so I was much more aware of, or aware that I was not aware of what was going on. So we were always, there was always a sense that at any moment we would have no place to live. At least that's the sense I gathered. And my great nightmare that I still have is being on the side of the road with no place to live with all my stuff, because that was the general idea that at least was conveyed into my mind, that at any moment we could be without a house, a home. Yeah, and so, but then meanwhile, they were making plans to leave wherever we were. Like leaving Ireland that time, there was no reason why we had to leave that house. They had taken it for 3 years, then they got the shakes and decided to take it only for a year. But my mother was getting lonely, and I don't know, they decided to come back. Well, we never knew this was going to happen. All of a sudden, we're moving again. And this happened a number of times. Many houses were sold out from underneath us, or taken by eminent domain, or something like that. But sometimes they just up and move, and we would hear about it. We would realize that we weren't going to see our friends at school that we'd made again. And I'm probably the person who, the other person who would have remembered this best is my sister Mary, who's dead. She was a year younger than me, and I don't know how my brothers feel about that, because they were considerably younger, and then my youngest sister. But that's how I felt about it. That was not only the fear of having nowhere to live, but the idea that something's going to be sprung on you, and you, at any moment, you will never see those people again. Anyway, my parents had no idea. They didn't see that at all.
Did you simply, like, as we say, buck up and sort of turn it into an adventure, these transatlantic voyages on ocean liners and so forth? And you were also, no doubt, helping to look after the younger children.
Yeah, that was pretty much my role, is looking after the younger people.
So you would have to have repressed any sense of alarm, for example, that you might have felt.
Yeah.
For their sake.
Yeah, I did. But I didn't do that consciously. I just did, that would have just been the way to keep peace. Peace.
Restraint.
Peace. Yeah.
It sort of redefines the parameters of Jesus is saying we have no lasting city here.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's one of his. That's one of Jim's favorite.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Well, he would say we have here no lasting home. So that would be another translation. He said that many times. We have here, and it was terribly funny to him.
Did he giggle or like grin or?
He was in that ironical way, you know.
Right.
Before moves, or sometimes just out of the blue, he would just say, "Betty, we have here no lasting home." And she'd say, "Oh, Jim." So, I mean, he took a great deal of intellectual pleasure in his plight. There's no question about it.
Indeed.
And that probably is Irish or something.
Just the riddle, the dark, bleak riddle of human existence.
That's
right.
exactly right. The riddle, the dark riddle of human existence. And he liked the idea that God had a sense of humor.
Right.
And so he could also he could enjoy the concept that God was having a bit of a laugh here and seeing how it's going to all work out. And I mean, he really did enjoy it. He didn't really, my mother really worried. He wasn't a big worrier. But he did get a strange enjoyment out of it.
One of the questions which I've always been puzzled by, having known Jim, having been invited over for dinner, both in the company of Thomas Wall, your uncle, who is a member of the monastic community, other monks in the English department, and many solitary dinners with Jim, and I have these vivid memories of that regal, sort of stiff-backed posture of his, sitting on a broken-down, castaway sofa, the dust motes floating in this moldering house in Flint Town in the shafts of the twilight and so forth. I mean, I can remember all of it so vividly. But one of the things that we never broached was his sense of the wrenching effect of the Vatican Council reforms in his own experience of Catholicism. If I may offer an anecdote, I did hospitality ministry. I was an usher in the Abbey Church for maybe 12 or 15 years altogether. And of course, as you famously said, both your mother and your father would plop themselves alone, the only people in the middle of the balcony in the Abbey Church, in the most remote space possible. And of course, it was a subject of both mirth and comment on the part of monks, right? And we saw. I can remember your mom's knit caps at daily mass, standing erect next to your father, and so forth. But I had to go and take up the collection. So part of my weekly responsibility, and Jim and I, it turned into a little game. You know, I would sort of take the basket, you know, hike up my kukula, my habit, and then sort of walk dutifully over, and I'd be walking there, and Jim would be sitting there like this. So this is how he sat through the Mass. He would never have any kind of ocular contact with what was going on with the priest up there, right? And the singing and all of that. And he would wait for me to arrive, and then he would be white knuckle. There would be something in a fist, and then he would break into this beautiful grin and throw a sweaty, wadded up dollar bill or so into the collection. But the grin was the sweetest. But I had to wait for it. In other words, I had to go there and get it, right? So, I mean, I was always wondering what kind of rigorous attachment to Catholic ritual, to Catholic sacramental life must inform him, and yet how chagrined he must be. And what I discovered was, in one of my favorite stories, Priestly Fellowship, he writes once again in this kind of strange, bifurcated way, a whole set of, say, notes with subheadings like home truths, changing standards, stranded. And I want to read Human Nature and have you comment on it. This is a priest musing in the story Priestly Fellowship, which is really about a bunch of priests sitting in a kind of lonely rectory in these dull, commonplace conversations, going around in circles and so forth. Human Nature. The church was irrelevant today. not concerned enough with the everyday problems of war, poverty, segregation, and so on, people said. But such talk was itself irrelevant, was really a criticism of human nature. Sell what you have and follow me, our Lord had told the rich young man, who had then gone away sad. That was human nature for you, and it hadn't changed. Let them take it who can, our Lord said of celibacy, and few could take it then or now. And that applies to heroic sacrifice of all kinds. Let's face it.
Mm-hmm.
What do you hear in that in relationship to the kind of unspoken sort of Catholic aura in your household when you were a kid and so forth?
Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't really resonate because, first of all, he never talked about religion with us at all.
Ever?
Ever. When I was growing up and I would visit him and I was writing a dissertation, alas, unfinished, that involved the Council of Trent and the invention of the concept of tradition and going through to Edmund Burke, etc.
I had no idea.
Yeah, well...
Oh my God, you have a theological pedigree.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, an unfinished one, alas. But in any case, so then I got really interested in the nature of the church, the relationship between, faith and authority and the magisterium and the whole history of the church. And anyway, so then, it was only then, but now I'm in my 30s, and so then we did discuss religion. But when we were growing up, I had no idea, really.
Did your mom was so devout.
Yeah,
she was a daily communicant.
Yes, but they kept that private. We did learn that sometimes we would be in a place where there was we would be going to a public school or something. So she taught us the catechism, and when we were very young, she read to us, stories from the Bible for children and all that kind of business. But there was never any discussion. I would not have been able to tell you what the difference between their theological outlook was and the person next door who was saying the family rosary,
right,
or saying the rosary during Mass, or the kind of uninformed,
the devotional, private devotional.
Yeah. So I never ever would have been able to know that there was any. I knew that we did not say the family rosary. But I just assumed because we were the kind of family who didn't do anything together. That would just be another thing that we didn't do together.
You were all sort of allowed to be liberated and to be singular from a really early age,
yeah.
My sense is. I mean, what we might call odd.
Yeah, well, we definitely were odd.
In the sense of the local, say, standards of sort of Eisenhower-like conformity and so forth. But so when you were grown up and you were working on sort of post-Trent theology and the role of authority in the church and so forth, did Jim reveal anything to you about that stuff, or was he funny about it, or? Well,
he wasn't interested in theory at all. He didn't like theory. He didn't like, and he didn't. His understanding of religion was so artistic in a way. Do you know what I mean?
It was aesthetic. It was the form.
That's what I meant.
That's the form.
That's what I meant. Aesthetic is the right word, yeah.
It was the form of the ritual, I bet.
Yeah, and he was very, in the earlier days, before Vatican II was even a blot on the horizon as far as he was concerned, he didn't like the churches in Milwaukee because they were Polish, and so there was too many gugas and all that sort of thing. On the other side, the Abbey Church here just simply appalled him.
It was too stark.
Yeah, it was too stark. So so he had views about the aesthetics. So it wasn't just the old and the new, but he had very strong views on the translation of the Mass into the vernacular, into the English.
He never accommodated himself to.
He couldn't bear the language. He couldn't understand why it had to be in that flat,
unimaginative.
Yeah, and some of the resonances were gone. So many of them gone. Many in his stories. The resonances from the Dewey version. Which is to say the King James version. They were just stripped away, and with that you lose a whole cultural inheritance that goes back centuries.
And so it was the poetic language and the form.
Yeah, exactly. So when we lived in Ireland after Vatican II, when they would say that Mass in English, except for one Mass on Sunday, the 9:30, which was in Irish. So he went to the Irish one, so he couldn't understand it.
A dark night of the soul experience.
So he liked that, you know.
So the indecipherability of, say, perhaps the sort of inexplicable mystery of Christ must have really, like the dark night of the soul, what we call the apophatic tradition in theology and so forth. I see that. I see Jim radiating that.
Yeah.
And I think he sensed that I intuited that.
Yeah.
I've always been drawn to the apophatic, wordlessness, closing your eyes and seeing darkness.
Yeah.
And staying with that.
Yeah.
As an experience of the divine.
Definitely. I think as a young man, he tried, you know, one time but I was older, I had used the expression somebody was a mystic in a disparaging manner, and it was a person who I met, but it was a kind of hippie type of person, you know, that kind of new age person.
He didn't like blue jeans.
No, and he didn't like new age stuff, and the people who call themselves mystics, but it's all, you know.
Right.
Anyway, and I said something, I said something dismissive about mystic, and he said, "You don't know what you're talking about." And then he did, this is one of the few times that he actually did describe what a mystic really was. In the Catholic mystic, well, I can't remember, unfortunately, but it was, I got the picture, and then I looked into it and I saw that he was right. But I also know from the letters that he did try to achieve that mystic state as a young person, particularly around the time before he went to prison. And when that great anxiousness about World War II, and then he was involved with the Catholic worker movement, and he really was, he had he went to 2 retreats, one in Pennsylvania, and it was part of the detachers, and then the one at St. John's, which really moved him. Apparently he had just a real epiphany and a kind of a dawning of a faith from Father John Hugo, which he attended. It was 4 priests, but he managed to get in thanks to his friends and present himself as a seminarian. They just told him to wear a dark suit, and then I don't think there was a lot of lying involved, but that's how he's there. But in any case, that preaching, Father John Hugo's preaching really, really moved him.
I'm really fascinated by this because I see something really forbidding and something rare and even terrifying, a kind of terrible beauty in James Carroll's turn of phrase, in Jim's kind of mysticism. It was definitely rigorous and a demand for holiness with a very high bar.
Yes.
But he had to write the rules, and they had to incorporate, it seems to me, all of those aesthetic, artistic aspirations and so forth. And speaking of aesthetics and artistic aspirations, one of Jim's fellow writers, Patricia Hampel, who was also a friend of St. John's and St. Ben's, who comes to the guest house and so forth, has written an appreciative review of your book in Commonweal, and I'd like to quote from it and then have you perhaps talk a bit about the afterword in the book where you praise Jim's style, writerly style, as having saved you from this sort of heartache that you had in putting this book together. So, Patricia Hampel writes of your book, "A true stylist can perhaps best be revealed in the free form of letters. The self displayed in fleet descriptions of the day, a captured instant, worry and wonder of the moment." That's so Jim to me. Powers does not disappoint. He reveals himself crabby and contentious, but ever relishing the vignettes presented by the passing world. The fierce coast of Ireland, its mossy stone walls, Irish whiskey before a peat fire. Even on a train to Chicago, his heart lifts into description. Quote, "The river on the Empire Builder was beautiful in a way I've seldom seen in the Middle West, raining slightly, with fog hanging over the river, and in notches in the little mountainous hills, with gray herons set out like lawn furniture." So, can you tell us in what way you discovered or rediscovered this sort of incomparable imagistic genius that you found lodged or studied in the letters?
Well, I think, first of all, I think that he felt released from his tribulations by putting things into words, his words, and injecting them with his drollery sometimes, irony sometimes. And when I began to partake of that feeling just in reading it. It did lance the boil in a way that the way it transformed it into literature, maybe not art, but a form of art. It transformed what had been at times a very grim and inexplicable situation was suddenly given order and coherence, even if it's only the coherence of humor. Well, I don't know, say only, that's one of the higher forms.
Satire, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it really, it's ironed out a lot of anger that I had. I had been angry, to be quite frank, when I started reading some of these. This book took 10 years to put together, and it wasn't 10 dedicated years, but in the early days, I just sometimes was very, very angry at the fecklessness, the moving for no reason, and just the general fecklessness of turning down extraordinary. He was offered $1,000 to use one short story, $1,000 to have a TV movie company to have an option on it for $1,000 for 3 years. He said no. They phoned back and this is when he's also complaining in his journal that he's got 25 cents to his name and the rent is due. So they phoned back from New York a couple of days later, and they're offering him $2,000 for 1 year. No. And I read that, and I remember when this was. It was in the 1960 or so. I remember how poor we were and how crazy my mother was with worry. And I just got so angry at him. Even reading that now kind of upsets me. But on the other hand, how ridiculous. What a ridiculous man. And then that's a point where in that letter he doesn't rejoice in his ridiculousness. But in other letters he does rejoice in his ridiculousness. And that, in general, that solved a lot of problems for me.
You make that so clear in the afterword to the book where you write, but to return to Jim's letters, in the end their wit and drollery and festive turns of phrase won me over. A distance developed between me, the person actually present in the predicament the letters describe, and me, the reader. Indeed, in selecting the letters to tell this story, I increasingly felt I was bringing order to a situation where there was little. With that came satisfaction and a certain amount of peace.
Yeah, that's.
It's so eloquent and so moving, Katherine. Even as I read it, I'd like to have you close, if you don't mind, by reading the last description of your father and mother just before she died, and then perhaps commenting on some of the last times you were together with them.
So this is me. This is from what I have written. This is the introduction.
It is,
yeah.
Indeed,
Okay,
yes.
It's the end of the introduction. Jim's letters are assertions of comic might against the absurdity, as he saw it, of his existence. He wrote them in part to stave off chaos, to give reality a shape of his own creation, however dark. As it happens, the last communication between my parents was conducted, in a manner of speaking, in writing, and was another attempt to fend off the unbearable. On the morning Betty died, that's my mother, at home, wasted by cancer, unstintingly cared for by Jim, he asked her what she would like for breakfast. She just shook her head, and he went off and returned with a pencil and a little checklist with entries for eggs and liver. Eggs, you know, with a little box, liver with a little box. He left, came back, no check mark. He took the list away again and returned with it, having added, with a little box, kisses. She smiled faintly and again shook her head. He left it with her, and when he returned again, she had marked liver. This struck him, as I have no doubt it was meant to, by Betty, partner and butt of his dark sense of humor, as perfect in its intransigence and bleak comedy. Betty died a couple of hours later. Jim said he spent that time telling her how sorry he was for having given her such a hard life and no home. He never really recovered from her death, though he lived for another 11 years, alone and long enough to be forced to leave another house slated for destruction.
Was that difficult to write? It's so moving to hear.
I did
you can see I'm
tear up.
moved.
Yeah, I did tear up. It was very difficult to write actually the mechanics of it. I mean, to even describe what I'm talking about. I'm glad that that I conveyed that. But that little checklist he kept in a little plastic envelope, and he kept it with his most precious things in a little box. That check that had eggs, liver, kisses.
Can you describe perhaps one of the last visits you had with either both of them or either of them? What the fragments of memory bring up for you?
Yeah, well, the last time I saw my father was probably a year or so before he died. He died in 1999, and I came with my children in 1998 to visit him. And at that time, he was immersed in writing, I think it was 1998. I might have that date wrong, but it doesn't matter. What he was doing was he was writing a little essay about Joseph O'Connell, the artist, that was going in a book devoted to Joseph O'Connell's art. And there was essays by various people, one of which was by Jim. And I knew that he was not his old self. And in fact, I'd had that feeling for the last few years. He was so much kinder and nicer. He always had kindness within him, but you'd only glimpse it on occasion.
Right.
But he had become very kind and gentle, and he was really good with my boys. Well, he always liked little boys anyway. But in any case, I read this thing that he wrote about Joe, and it was the first draft. He said, "I want to know what you think of this." And I read it. Well, again and again, he kept hitting the theme of Joe having to drive so much. He couldn't get over it. He said he would drive to the season, and then he'd do this, and then it was all this driving. And I said, I don't know whether you've noticed this or not, but you brought up Joe's driving, having to drive places about 7 times here. So he cut out most of them, I think. But I thought, well, there it is. He was worried about, even if Joe was dead, he was still worried about Joe having to do so much driving.
Yes.
That's how I remember him, the last, generous and kind, and very worried about all that driving.
That's remarkable. There's almost like a maternal concern that emerged after the departure of your mother.
Yes, I would say that's true.
Perhaps it gave him permission to experience a bit more of that maternal care and nurturance. Katherine Powers, I cannot tell you what a pleasure it's been. As you can see, I myself am deeply moved by your visit, and I want to thank you for the work that you've done and for helping us to resuscitate the memory of one of the handful of great modernist writers in American letters, according to all of the most respected authorities. And so, on behalf of the English Web, I want to say thank you to Katherine Powers, and once again to hail this new book, Suitable Accommodations, the autobiography of a family life, The Letters of Jim Powers. Thank you very much.